Are you saying that there is a pattern of relationships between the three modalities across domains?
So the domain of the universe can, in a sense, be understood in terms of this triplication. And this triplication itself can be understood in terms of an even deeper pattern described by something called the axioms. And just to sort of round out the example, the notion of do, be, and become is itself a triple. Is there anything that is neither doing, being, or becoming? It's another koan. At some point, again, meditating on that for some time, you'll probably discover, as many people already have, that the answer to that is just flat no. And so in effect, as we start to explore these triples, right, we start to notice that in places we like, and so someone might come up and say, well, actually, maybe there are real polarizations. Like maybe there are places where are really just two. And I'd say, well, give me an example. And they'd say, well, what about truth and falsity? And I'd say, that's very interesting. What is the relationship between truth and falsity? Is the relationship between true and false as a distinction that distinguishes the true from the false, or that distinguishes the concept of true as being different from the concept of false, and the concept of false as being somehow different than the concept of true? What is that notion of difference? Is the notion of difference true, or is it false? Another koan. And again, if you play with that for a while, at some point you realize that the notion of distinction between true and false can either be understood purely in terms of just that which is true, because if I made it part of the truth, then I can say, well, what's the difference between truth and falsity that is other than distinction? Because clearly there's something else. They're distinguished somehow, right? So in effect, there's a sense here in which we kind of realize it can't be part of one or the other. It has to be something else. And if it's something other than truth or falsity, then that something other than has its own class. It's at least as deep as the concept of truth and falsity. So in effect, we notice that this sort of thing happens a lot. Someone might present an example of content and context. Is the relationship between content and context a proper subset of content or a proper subset of context? Content or context. Relationship between content and context is neither content nor context. It is something else. And so in effect, what happens is that we begin to notice that this notion of threeness isn't just incidental. It turns out to be really profound to the very nature of the process of thinking, the very nature of the process of being, that the fact that we're noticing a kind of triplication between do, be, and become basically means that this notion of triplication is it's somehow part of doing, being, and becoming. So in effect, there's a sense here in which we're basically beginning to say, okay, we need to pay attention to this, right? We need to actually take this seriously. So for instance, what does it mean to know something? Well, knowing is based upon perception. I perceive it, I see it. Well, what about the process of perception? Is there threeness in perception? Well, actually there is. There's the perceiver, and then there's the perceived. The thing I'm looking at and the person that's looking. And the process of perception that somehow light, for example, is emitted from the thing, and it flows towards me, it flows towards my eyes and is received by my being, and somehow I become conscious that I see a book on the table. That this process of perception is entwined with, cannot not be entwined with, perceiver and perceived. The perceiving, perceiver, and perceived are themselves distinct, inseparable, and non-interchangeable concepts. They are distinct, inseparable, and non-interchangeable realities. And so, at the most profound level of what it means to even know, we see this triplication showing up. And there are lots of examples. I mean, I'm just basically giving you a flavor of it at this moment, right? So in effect, if we're saying, okay, we have this sort of dynamic, and the dynamic has this threeness built into it. How do we really come to grips with that threeness, right? Well, one of the things that we notice is that there's this sort of distinction in terms of how each of the concepts is held. Like there's somehow a sense in which the relationship between truth and falsity is a primary concept that upholds the notions of truth and falsity. I can't have the relationship without the things related, but I can't have the things related without the relationship. So in this sense, we're starting to observe that this pattern itself holds, like the perception is a deeper process than both the perceiver and the perceived. And then I would stop there, and that would be another meditation or another koan. So in effect, just bear in mind that in a class like this, I'm needing to go fast. This recording would be something that you might listen to more than once so that the sequencing begins to make a little sense. But the idea here is that this notion of threeness is showing up as essentially a thing that's happening over and over and over again. The archetypes of those three concepts are given the names of immanent, omniscient, and transcendent. And we notice that one of the patterns that occurs when we say that foundational triplication is happening in every domain, we notice that it's always three, and that this distinctness, inseparableness, and non-interchangeableness is an inherent aspect of the pattern of always being a threeness at the foundation of any domain. And so we canonize that idea. And that becomes what I'm now going to call axiom 3. So in effect, the idea of foundational triplication finds expression in the notion of axiom 3. That at the foundation of every domain, there are three concepts that are distinct, inseparable, non-interchangeable. So since I'm working with the archetypes of the concepts and the pattern that we're talking about applies across all these domains, then I'm going to simply say that the immanent, the omniscient, and the transcendent are distinct, inseparable, and non-interchangeable. And you might even notice that even in the expression of the axiom itself, that this notion of threeness is showing up. The words distinctness, inseparability, and non-interchangeableness is itself a kind of triplication. And so in effect, I'm taking the triplication of the modalities as the archetype of those concepts, and then I'm combining them in a three-way pairing to these notions of distinctness, inseparable, non-interchangeable. And I'm basically saying this is a deep truth of being. In the same sort of way, it projects up into this pattern we call axiom 1. Axiom 1 is basically saying that in every triple, that one of the concepts is going to act as a kind of mediation between the other two. And we see that with perception. The process of perceiving is a kind of mediation between the perceiver and the perceived. That the notion of relationship is a kind of mediation between the notion of truth and falsity. And so in effect, even if we were to look at domains, relations, and identities, the notion of relationship itself between the content, i.e. what we would think of as identities, and the context, what we normally think of as a domain, that the relationship between content and context is somehow itself providing the context in which the concepts themselves are related. Like I'm using the words content and context as concepts, and I'm noticing that the relationship between those concepts is itself held as a primary concept relating to other concepts. And so this becomes what is known as axiom 1, that the immanent is more fundamental than the omniscient and the transcendent. And that the notion of the omniscient and the transcendent are conjugate with one another. That's a technical term. We'll come back to that later. At this point, I just want to give you a sense that one of the main ideas in these patterns that show up is the notion that relationship is more basic than the things related. And if you look at the triples, if we start exploring a lot of examples of the triples, you'll notice that in every case, axiom 1 applies. So in this specific sense, we're starting to get a glimmer of these patterns. And we're starting to get a sort of orientation about how these kinds of things actually show up in the real universe, in the real world, right? That they're not just concepts, that they are, in a sense, part of the dynamic of being itself. So, again, to just sort of act as a kind of contextualization, right? Like this subject matter that I'm talking about, that I'm effectively teaching in this moment, is generally called metaphysics. Well, what is metaphysics? Well, in the classical sense, metaphysics is a collection of questions. Some of these questions are things like, who am I? Why am I here? Right? Is this all there is? What matters? In when we look at the sort of early places, because people have been asking these questions around campfires going all the way back to times when language was just begun, that at some point or another, that each person in their lives ask these questions. And some of us get really interested in these questions and decide to make it a kind of life exploration, to really get profound with these questions, to really explore them to the maximum extent possible, to go all the way. And so in effect, we start to distill the questions down. Like, so for instance, we get to, why am I here becomes a why question. Why this versus why that, or why anything with anything after the why question. Anything after the why can fill in the blanks, but ultimately we're looking for some sort of explanation. But somebody could ask, well, how do we know? Right? Well, like we're talking about something that we're saying what is, and then we could say, well, how do we know what is? In fact, what is? That's a question. Is this all there is? Is asking what is? Who am I? Is a kind of what am I question. And somewhere along the way, we just want to know, what is the being? What is the isness? And we could say things that at first would appear a kind of tautology, is. But that's a road for another day. At this moment, we just noticed that the question of what is a pretty low-level question. And the question of how do we know is a pretty low-level question. And the question of why does it matter is a pretty low-level question. And it turns out that these three lowest-level questions got names. So a little more technical language. The question of what is, as a subject, the entire exploration of the subject or the question what is gets the name ontology. So if you see the word ontology in a book, it refers to the question of what is and everything that comes after that, whatever people might provide as answers or stories or narratives or creation mythologies or whatever. Anything after the question what is that is proposed is included in this notion of explorations of ontology. And the question of how do we know? How do we know anything? What does it mean to know something? And a minute ago, I mentioned perception. I says, well, there's a flow from the perceived to the perceiver through the process of perception, and that this is somehow at the basis of knowing, but saying that there's perceiver, perceived, and perceiving is already presuming an answer to the ontology question. What is? Well, there's a perceiver, there's a perceived, and there's a perceiving. But how do we know that there is those kinds of things? Well, somewhere along the way, we have to actually consider the question of how do we know anything at all? What does it mean to know something? What does it mean to perceive? And that question is called the question of epistemology. And the question of why does it matter? What matters? What's ultimately valuable? What's ultimately meaningful? This collection of questions, or the root questions of why does it matter, that's called the question of axiology. Now, I'm using these terms as, I guess, somewhat traditionally. I mean, some people will interpret them in slightly different ways. Different philosophers have different ways of rendering these kinds of things. But I think that most philosophers would agree that I got pretty close to the essence describing it in that sense. But here's where the change occurs. This is the turn. The turn is that, well, isn't it interesting that the core notion of what metaphysics is about is these three topics: ontology, epistemology, and axiology. That's a threeness. It's a threeness that's just as basic as the notion of creation, existence, and interaction as being the threeness that upholds the notion of universe. In this case, ontology, epistemology, and axiology is the threeness that upholds the notion of metaphysics. If I know everything there is to know about being, knowing, and value, I know everything there is to know within the scope of the subject of metaphysics. But how do we come to know that? How do we appreciate the beingness and the value of things? Well, this is where we come back to the basis of foundational triplication and type isomorphism, and how the modalities and the axioms work together to provide a kind of supermodel, a model that has a supernatural characteristic that effectively is descriptive of all that nature is and beyond. If there is any concept that goes beyond nature, then this would do that. So in that sense, the axioms as a description of the pattern is effectively the keys through which we not only understand the nature of these triples, it actually gives us a way for identifying the triples themselves, and it gives a way for identifying the meaning of the triple terms. So in other words, the notion of immanent is realized as that which fits the model of axiom one, that whatever, if I find three concepts which are distinct, inseparable, and non-interchangeable, if I do the exercise to sort of get to the root of a domain and identify what that triple is, and we can talk about how that's done, then at a certain point we can basically say which of these three concepts is the relationship between the other two. And if we identify that concept, then I'm going to give it the label immanent. In the same sort of way that if I put a single object on the table, I'm going to say one. And if I put three objects on the table, I'm going to say three. It is in this sense that I attach the notion immanent to the concept of relationship. And if I was dealing with it, like, let's go back to the example of universe. The notion of interaction is effectively a relationship between creation and existence. Right? Change can be change that is, in a sense, keeping maybe the level of, in one sense, a constancy, but in another sense, every change is new. And in that sense, partakes of creation. Right? The future, in effect, has the notion of the future has a sense of newness associated with it. And so in this sense, we're looking at interaction as, in some sense, mediating between the notion of creation and existence. And in that sense, we can therefore also apply the notion of immanent, the label of immanent, to the notion of interaction. And this methodology of essentially identifying the modality of a concept, right? The modality being, for the notion of modality is essentially held as the collection of terms, immanent, omniscient, and transcendent. Those three terms taken together form a collection, and that collection is given a name, the name being modality. And it's roughly the same move as, for example, if I have all of the integers and I say number. I take the entire collection of integers, or I take the entire collection of numbers, and I say collectively, we're going to give it the label number. So in this sense, the notion of modalities, if anything, is much simpler than the notion of numbers. There are a lot of numbers. There's an infinity of numbers. There's an infinity of integers, and there's an infinity of an entirely different kind when we talk about real numbers, like the continuum. So in this particular sense, to just have three concepts as our primary working basis is a lot less cumbersome than, say, having an infinity of numbers to play with. But that trade, in the sense of being more abstract, right? So in the sense that numbers are more abstract than the things that are pointed by a given number. Like, for instance, I might say, hey, it's 48 degrees out, 48 degrees Fahrenheit, right? I even have a unit, right? There's a sense in which that notion might be meaningful. Oh, that's kind of chilly. I should probably wear a sweater. So in this sense, we can say, hey, the abstraction of 40 some odd degrees in some temperature scale is meaningful in the embodiment of, I need to wear a sweater. Well, in that sense, the abstraction is useful. It has a way, it helps us to communicate about things, right? So for instance, the number, in the sense of being simpler than trying to describe what it means to feel like when you're cold. Is it really cold, or is it only a little cold? And we have to sort of negotiate by what sort of experience he's had. We now have a way of sort of comparing it to something that's easy to relate to, and that makes it easier for us to talk about. So in this sense, the modalities, the concepts of the modalities, or the thing pointed to by the modalities to refer to general relationships between concepts, is helpful in the same sort of way, right? In the sense that 46 degrees refers to something that is an experience, and the map refers to territory. The modalities refer to abstractions in the relationships between concepts. And so someone would say, okay, well, in the same sort of way that numbers cover a lot of things, if we go more abstract, it covers more stuff, more things can be talked about. Not as well, but as I go simpler, I get more range, right? The idea of dealing with the map is a lot easier than dealing with the territory, and to some extent, I can plan my route on the map. And there's a lot less energy involved in figuring out one's plan on a map than figuring out one's plan in actual space. It's a heck of a lot of walking you're going to have to do, or driving around, if you're trying to learn what the space looks like just from firsthand physical experience, whereas a map can basically orient you, and you can say, I want to go here and to do that. In the same sort of way, the numbers help us to orient, and the modalities help us to orient, but the scope of what we can orient to increases as the abstraction goes up. The more abstract, the wider the things that we can orient to. Well, if we abstract the maximum degree possible, right? You noticed a minute ago I was talking about abstraction. And I mentioned, oh, by the way, there's a dual concept. There's this notion of instruction. And the relationship between abstraction and instruction is neither abstraction nor instruction. It's something else. What does it take to make an abstraction? Well, there's a consciousness involved. What does it take to make an instruction? Well, somebody said something. So in a sense, the subjective, the sense of self, the sense of one's mind or being, is neither an abstraction nor an instruction. It's something else. And so in this sense, there is, even in the notion of abstraction, there is a triple. It's part of a triple, and there is itself a triple, right? I talked about form and moving away from form and simplification, right? So the concept of abstraction isn't nuclear. It has components. It has things that are necessary and sufficient to characterize the notion of abstraction. The same way that when we talked about universe, we said that the three concepts of creation, existence, and interaction are necessary, and together they are sufficient to characterize the notion of universe. So now I'm going to make an observation. I'm going to basically point out that insofar as the three concepts at the foundation of every domain can, in a sense, be described by the same pattern, and therefore end up with these labels, one each, of immanent, omniscient, transcendent. And insofar as the notion of abstraction itself is partaking of this model, then in effect the model is describing itself, and therefore it shows me that this notion of immanent, omniscient, transcendent, and the pattern of the axioms is the most abstract abstraction possible to have, because it wraps over the very notion of possibility itself. So, yes, on one hand, learning this is immensely challenging, right? Because we're dealing with the most abstract concepts possible to have, the most Spartan, bare of details, simple as it can possibly be. Now, on one hand, this is good news. The good news is that, yeah, it may be really, really hard to grasp this, but it can't get any harder, right? This is effectively as difficult as it gets. Things from this point aren't necessarily going to get easier in the sense that it'll get less difficult in time, but it won't get more difficult in time. As we move forward through these descriptions, as I begin to give more clarity about these ideas, you can at least have the confidence that this will both have tremendous utility, because these are really abstract concepts and therefore cover all that can be, right? This is essentially the most powerful form of knowledge, the strongest form of knowledge possible to have.